talk about, well, actually talking of Ukrainian refugees, what is going on in Ukraine right now? We've seen what's been called a serious international incident with a Russian fighter jet in the NATO, arriving in Poland. And we've also got the Wagner boss being very publicly critical of Vladimir Putin. What's going on? Let's talk to the man who'll definitely be in the know, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's the former commander of the US Army in Europe and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Hey, Julia. Good morning.
Very good to talk to you. It's been quite a while. Sadly, we are still involved in a war in Ukraine. It didn't end as quickly as Vladimir Putin wanted it. It's not ending as quickly as we would all like for the Ukrainians people. Let's talk first of all about this Poland summoning Russia's ambassador over an incident involving a Russian fighter jet and a Polish border guard aircraft over the Black Sea. What happened there?
Well, this is routine business for how Russia operates, constantly pressing the limits, trying to provoke things, hoping that we might overreact, and finding out how do we respond when they come close to our borders. I think these kind of things happened a lot during the Cold War, but there was always a sort of a protocol and a discipline. I'm more concerned now about the lack of professionalism and actually the lack of quality of Russian pilots these days.
Well, yeah, well, indeed. I mean, this aircraft for Poland that were on patrol, the European Union's border agency, Frontex, narrowly avoiding this collision with the Russian fighter jet. It's called a serious international incident. What we've been trying to avoid all this time, we're told, is a confrontation between NATO and Russia, and basically fighting this war with Ukraine by proxy to not get involved in that sort of World War type conflict. And this is the worry, isn't it, that as these things escalate, this could happen by accident?
Well, this is important. It's an incident, but it's part of a fabric of how Russia operates. Yeah. And so when people talk about why can't we just negotiate with the Russians? Come on, let's end this conflict. Let's negotiate a settlement. Not ever does Russia live up to international law or any agreement unless they're forced to. And so we should be very circumspect when we start pressing Ukraine to consider some sort of concessions if we really, because the Russians will not stop with that unless they are stopped.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, one of the big issues here is, is how they are going to be stopped. Donald Trump did a CNN town hall meeting. Basically, it's audience being able to ask questions on air as head of his sort of bid for the Republican nomination for the presidency last night. It's been in the news because he called the woman who he's now having to pay $5 million a lying whack job over the sex case that was brought as a civil action by her. But actually, I think one of the things that was even more worrying than that was him talking about how he wants to end the war in Ukraine. He was asked, who do you want to win that war, Ukraine or Russia? Because that's the decision. Someone's got to win it ultimately. And he just talked about he wants to end it. And he's talked about how he could end it in one day. Now, the only way he could do that is if Russia basically kept all the territory that they've taken from Ukraine. Are you concerned that if there were either Donald Trump or indeed possibly Ron DeSantis, he was a Republican candidate, a Republican in the White House, that actually, or perhaps, I don't know, maybe a different Democrat, they would take a different view on supporting Ukraine with the military hardware and the billions in dollars in aid that is enabling them to fight Russia?
I think that the bipartisan support in Congress for Ukraine is so strong and so broad that I'm not worried that that this is going to drop off here in the next few months, or even with a change of administration. Certainly, I hope that we will not have a repeat of the catastrophe of a Trump administration. He revealed once again how devoid he is of reality and strategic thinking on this so-called town hall last night. But put that aside, this war could actually end by the end of this year if the United States and UK and Germany and France said, we want Ukraine to win. Because if we said that, and this is the only place where I would fault my president on this whole Ukraine situation, is that he hasn't clearly defined what is the strategic outcome that we want. And because we haven't clearly defined that, then we continue to make incremental decisions about, should we provide this, should we provide that? And this is oxygen for the Kremlin, that they can see that we're not 100% committed stand fast the large amount of resources that have been provided. If U.S. and U.K. in particular would say we want Ukraine to win, then this thing, I believe, would be over by the end of this year. I think the Russians are much, much closer to collapse than we think.
Well, this thing, we've had so much talk about the spring offensive, the counter-offensive, and we know that, there's a lot of it is affected by the weather, the temperatures, and whether or not you're trying to drive tanks over frozen ground or muddy quagmires. But then there's also this concern that the Ukrainian forces simply haven't got, the training with the hardware that they're getting, or indeed the hardware on the ground ready to be used. They've not got the fighter jets they want yet, and that they're still waiting on very slow processes going through many European and also in America to actually get the hardware to them. Everyone talks a good game, but you actually got to get it onto the ground. Are you expecting a Russian offensive and then a counteroffensive that defeats the Russians, or are we looking at inch by inch by inch the Ukrainians regaining territory and Russia being pushed back to maybe just to Crimea or even out of Crimea? When you talk about Ukrainians winning, what are you seeing there? What does that look like to you?
You know me by now, Julia. I'm an optimist at heart, but in this case, I'm optimistic because we know from history that war is a test of will and it's a test of logistics. And the Ukrainians clearly have superior will. There's no Russian soldier on the ground in Ukraine that wants to be there. Yeah. And the logistical situation for Ukraine continues to get better while it worsens for the Russian side. I think there are three main conditions that General Zaluzhny, the chief of defense, is working on. And when those three conditions are met, then he will turn to President Zelensky and say, we're ready to go. Number one, his own forces. And that's what you've alluded to. Do we have enough forces that are at a level of training on what we call combined arms, tanks, infantry, engineers, artillery, air defense, working together that could penetrate on a narrow front in 2 or 3 places these long Russian defenses? They don't have to attack the full 900 miles. They just have to find the 2 or 3 places where they can penetrate. So that's number one. The second condition is the enemy force. Is the Ukrainian general staff confident that there's been enough disruption on the Russian side, that the Russians have been confused about where it's going to happen, attacks on these fuel storage that we've all been watching, all of these kind of things. This is part of setting condition number 2. And then condition number 3, exactly as you say, is the trafficability, the ground. I think that they still are a few weeks away to the point where the ground is dry and can sustain hundreds of armored vehicles churning it up. When those 3 conditions are set, then I think they'll go. Just
finally, can I ask you about this Wagner boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, I think. He's put a video online in which he appears to have called Vladimir Putin a complete something hole. I can't say what it is on air. And he's been very critical. He was someone who was very much sort of, on the side and supportive of Vladimir Putin, is now being very, very critical. How significant is this figure, and how significant is it that he's openly, critical of the Russian president?
So any day I expect to hear a report of him flying out of a window because he is so openly critical. The fact that he's still alive tells me that he generates so much money for the Kremlin through his mining operations in Africa, where he protects, that they're willing to tolerate that. Now, of course, he takes no orders from the Russian general staff, Shoigu, Gerasimov. He doesn't take orders from them. And so in a way, the fact that he was blaming them for not providing him enough ammunition is partly, I think, targeting the Russian domestic audience to say, hey, it's not my fault.
It's his over there. Fascinating. There's just so much going on, isn't there? Really appreciate you joining us. Always so good to get your thoughts, your time, your expertise. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired former commander of the US Army in Europe. Quick word from Alan Tolhurst from Politics Home, listening to that. I mean, we're about to have the Eurovision Song Contest, which we're hosting for Kyiv in Liverpool on Saturday. I forgot the second semi-final is tonight. And we're hosting on their behalf because, when they won last year, you can host post it. Well, no, you can't. They did say initially they could because this war is ongoing. But everyone seems to be it's a waiting game right now for these spring offensives, which are now going to be. They'll be autumn offensives at this rate.
Yeah, pretty much. So Zelensky's given an interview overnight where he basically says that they're not quite ready yet. They need a bit more time. He reckons if they launch now, they'd lose a lot of people. So clearly, it's not a secret offensive. It's very clear they're going to do it. It's just they need a bit more time. And obviously, he's going to keep drumming up support essentially ahead of that time.
Indeed.